In the world of science, it's rare to find a story where a skeptic becomes the key witness to something extraordinary. But that's exactly what happened to Dr. Helen Wambach, a woman who set out to destroy the myth of reincarnation and ended up scientifically validating it. Armed with logic, discipline, and a stack of standardized questionnaires, she spent years gathering data that, in her mind, would debunk the idea of past lives once and for all. Yet what she found was far from imaginary. Thousands of people placed under hypnosis didn't just tell vague stories, they recalled precise details. They named historical periods, described ancient coins, local foods, forgotten rituals, and even the sensations of death itself, as if they had walked those paths many times before. These weren't mystics or spiritual seekers. They were doctors, engineers, housewives, and students. Ordinary people with no agenda, no script, and no idea what others had said before them. And yet their answers aligned in ways too specific to be chance. What started as a controlled experiment quietly became one of the most compelling challenges to the materialist view of consciousness. And at the heart of it was one woman whose name the world has largely forgotten, but whose work deserves to be remembered. Helen Wambach wasn't a mystic. She held a doctorate in psychology and taught psychotherapy and parapsychology at several colleges in California. Trained in the scientific method, she approached the world with logic, structure, and data. In the early 1960s, her work focused on regression therapy, using hypnosis to help people revisit childhood memories and resolve emotional trauma. But what began as a clinical tool soon led her into unfamiliar territory. During some sessions, clients unexpectedly began describing moments that occurred before their birth, fragments of what seemed to be lives lived in other times. Still, Wambach was skeptical. The idea of reincarnation was surrounded by exaggeration, fantasy, and stories no one could prove. One case in particular shaped her critical view, the story of Bridie Murphy. In the 1950s, an American housewife named Virginia Tighe claimed, under hypnosis, to recall a past life as an Irish woman named Bridie Murphy. Her story made headlines, inspired a book, even a movie, but investigations revealed major inconsistencies. Worse, Tighe had known someone by that name in childhood, which likely explained the memories. Many dismissed the case as cryptomnesia, a forgotten memory mistaken for something new. The credibility of past life regression took a serious hit. Wambach paid attention. If these memories were just hidden recollections or fantasy, she wanted to prove it through rigorous science. Her goal became clear: build a large-scale, statistically sound study that could either confirm or disprove reincarnation. She avoided the mistakes of earlier cases. Rather than doing private hypnosis sessions, which could be biased, she developed a system of group hypnosis. Beginning in 1966, over the span of 10 years, Wambach guided more than 2,000 people through carefully structured regression sessions. These weren't open-ended journeys. She didn't let people drift randomly into the past. Instead, she directed them to specific time periods: 2,000 years before Christ, 500 years before Christ, 25 years after Christ, the year 1200, 1500, and 1850. These points were chosen intentionally to control the imagination. If participants were just making things up, Wambach reasoned, they'd gravitate to familiar eras like ancient Egypt, the Roman Empire, or the American Wild West, times glorified in movies and books. Each person answered the same set of questions after the session. What kind of clothes were you wearing? What did you use to eat? Spoons, knives, chopsticks. What was your job? Your gender? Skin color? How did you die? Where did you live? What kind of money did you use? The goal was to filter out fantasy by focusing on simple, factual details, the kind of things people wouldn't know unless they had studied history in depth. Wambach had a theory. If these memories were imaginary, she'd see patterns. People would tend to remember being rich or powerful, royalty, warriors, priests. Most would say they were men, since history often spotlights men. Their stories would cluster around well-known timelines and reflect pop culture more than obscure facts. But that's not what happened. The more data she collected, the more surprised she became. People described ordinary lives, quiet, rough, and unremarkable. They weren't queens or emperors. They were farmers, servants, midwives, soldiers, not commanders, just common foot soldiers. They remembered having calloused feet, wearing coarse fabrics, eating from wooden bowls, and living in tiny homes without windows. They didn't remember glory. They remembered pain, disease, childbirth, war. Their stories felt gritty, raw, and strangely real. Even more striking, these details lined up with historical records. Across hundreds of sessions, the distribution of gender, class, and even population density began to match what we know about the past. People from different cities, different states, who had never met, when taken to the same historical period, described the same kinds of tools, food, clothes, and customs. Wambach didn't change the protocol. She didn't try to lead people or prove anything. She just kept collecting data, letting the numbers speak. But slowly, her original hypothesis started to collapse. What she had designed to debunk reincarnation began to suggest something else entirely. By the time she published her first book, Reliving Past Lives, Helen Wambach was no longer trying to disprove the idea of reincarnation. She was trying to understand it. The neat stacks of questionnaires gathered under strict clinical conditions were telling a story she never expected. The ancient belief she set out to challenge was not so easy to dismiss. In fact, it may not have been a belief at all. The first waves of data from Helen Wambach's group hypnosis sessions revealed something no one expected. Least of all, Wambach herself. Her entire method was built on the belief that fantasy could be identified through patterns. She thought people would imagine exciting lives, favor well-known periods of history, or invent stories shaped by movies, books, or cultural bias. But when she began reviewing thousands of questionnaires, the results told a different story. One that was far more organized, consistent, and historically accurate than fantasy could explain. The gender breakdown alone was revealing. Out of more than 1,100 recorded regressions, about 50.6% of participants recalled lives as men and 49.4% as women. This near-perfect balance went against her expectations. If people were making things up, she thought they'd be more likely to imagine themselves as men, given the greater power and status men held throughout history. But the data didn't cooperate. Participants remembered being both male and female across many different lives, suggesting a kind of biological and spiritual balance, not wishful thinking. The same went for social class. Wambach assumed that most people would place themselves in upper-class roles, kings, queens, nobles, or leaders. But over 70% of participants described lives in the lower class, as laborers, farmers, servants, and soldiers. Around 20% recalled being part of the middle class, merchants, blacksmiths, or local officials. Fewer than 10% remembered anything like nobility or wealth. These results closely mirrored real historical populations, especially in pre-industrial and feudal societies. If fantasy were driving the memories, the numbers would be skewed toward status and privilege. But instead, they followed reality, and that made them harder to dismiss. Even the time periods people remembered matched what we know about population growth. More lives were recalled from the year 1500 and later, when global population increased dramatically. Fewer people remembered lives in earlier eras, like 500 years before Christ, or 25 years after Christ, when fewer humans were alive. In each session, Wambach gave participants a set menu of dates to choose from. 2,000 years before Christ, 500 years before Christ, 25 years after Christ, the year 1200, 1500, and 1850. She expected people to favor periods like ancient Egypt or medieval Europe, eras made famous in popular culture. But again, the responses mirrored historical reality more than fantasy. It wasn't just the numbers that challenged her assumptions, it was the detail. Participants described everyday tools and materials that only a student of history would typically know. Handmade eating utensils, types of cloth, how food was stored or cooked, even local currencies and social customs. One man recalled living in a fishing village on what is now the island of Indonesia and eating a kind of nut he didn't recognize. Months later, while flipping through a magazine, he saw the nut in a photograph. It turned out to be native to the island of Bali. Another person described eating radishes in a small village in the Middle East, despite never having eaten them in their current life. Clothing, too, was often described in exact terms. People recalled coarse wool tunics, sandals made of twisted grass, leather belts fastened with wooden pegs. One woman remembered being a knight in Italy during the 13th century and noted how strange it was to wear pointed leather boots. She had always believed medieval boots were rounded, but later she found an image in a historical encyclopedia showing pointed footwear as common for that region and era. Another subject described a specific coin from 15th century Northern Europe, its shape, size, texture, and engraved symbols. Details so precise they could only be verified in academic sources, not movies or novels. And here's what might be most surprising: how rarely anyone got the facts wrong. Out of thousands of sessions, only about 1% included major historical inaccuracies. One of the few examples was a person who described playing a piano in the 15th century, though the piano wasn't invented until the early 1700s. But aside from such rare mistakes, the memories were shockingly accurate. Wambach often had to check academic archives just to verify the details. Again and again, they held up. This level of consistency is difficult to explain through imagination alone. If people were inventing stories, the results would have been chaotic, symbolic, or dramatic. But what Wambach recorded was the opposite: quiet, grounded, and realistic. People weren't telling stories of fame or adventure. They recalled baking bread, washing clothes, hauling buckets of water, dying from fevers or infections. They remembered the scratch of wool blankets, the sound of farm animals outside wooden huts, the smell of smoke from cooking fires. These weren't fantasies. They were fragments of ordinary lives. For Wambach, the implications were stunning. She had expected fantasy. She found data. And inside that data was something profound. A calm, consistent voice that spoke not of dreams, but of memory. Not one life, many. Not tales for attention, but recollections repeated across hundreds of minds. To her, these weren't illusions, they were echoes of history. And that history, she began to believe, was being told by the soul itself. As Helen Wambach's research into past life memories deepened, a new and unexpected theme began to emerge, one that she had not originally set out to study. During the post-hypnotic questionnaires, many subjects began to volunteer information about a curious phase that didn't belong to any specific lifetime. It was something in between. A space between death and rebirth. A state of awareness that seemed to exist before the soul entered the body again. Wambach hadn't initially asked about this inner life period, but the frequency and clarity of the reports compelled her to investigate further. What she found would lead her into the most metaphysical territory of all: what happens between lives and how the next life is chosen. She began incorporating specific questions about this in-between state in later sessions, asking participants what they remembered before entering their current body. The responses were surprisingly coherent across different groups, locations, and demographics. Many participants described a realm of peace, light, and guidance, a non-physical environment where decisions were made, purposes reviewed, and relationships planned. A common element in these accounts was the presence of what subjects called a guide or wise voice, a calm, intelligent presence that helped them understand their previous experiences and select the circumstances of their next incarnation. Some participants spoke of having a strong sense of mission. "Yes, I chose to be born," one subject wrote. "Someone did help me choose, and it seemed to be some voice that I trusted greatly. It was kind, helpful, and wise. Very wise. When you asked the purpose for this lifetime, it flashed that I was to broaden people's minds." Others felt less in control. "No, I didn't choose to be born," another subject recalled. "I was instructed to return. I felt no rebellion, just that it was not really my choosing." These differing perspectives suggested a nuanced process, sometimes voluntary, sometimes directed, yet rarely arbitrary. Even those who felt sent or guided still reported a sense of purpose once embodied. The decision to incarnate was often tied to lessons, unfinished relationships, or goals. People reported reuniting with souls they had known before, friends, lovers, siblings, even enemies, returning in different roles to work out unresolved dynamics. "My mother in this life," one participant wrote, "was my wife in a past life. My father was my son. I got some faint flashes of mates or lovers, but nothing clear. As to children and other relatives, I felt uncertain, except for one uncle who came through clearly as someone I knew before." These connections often explain the immediate emotional intensity people felt towards certain individuals, even from early childhood. Wambach also explored the moment of connection between soul and body. Contrary to expectations, few participants described entering the fetus at conception. The vast majority reported that their soul remained in a state of observation until late in pregnancy, with many entering only shortly before or during birth. One subject wrote, "I attached to the fetus when I decided to meet it in the womb of my mother just before birth. The feelings of my mother were very positive and loving and warm." Others echoed this delayed connection. One person described being in and out of the fetal body during the final trimester, as though testing the waters of a new experience. Some remained detached until labor began. The birth itself was often described as disorienting, intense, and jarring, but followed by a surge of recognition or joy. Interestingly, the souls didn't always feel emotionally neutral about the life they were entering. Some were excited, others were apprehensive. A few were reluctant, sensing hardship ahead. But even those who hesitated often spoke of understanding that the challenges were necessary. One of the purposes for this lifetime seemed to be to teach and to minister to mankind. One subject said, "I felt that psychology was moving too slowly and hampering the spiritual development of mankind. I didn't seem to have chosen my sex. My mother had been my sister in a past life, where we fought all the time. My husband was a Sioux Indian when I was a French padre, and I didn't like him then either." These comments weren't poetic abstractions. They were detailed reflections of continuity between lives, a pattern of entanglements and opportunities for growth. Wambach was not quick to make metaphysical conclusions. She remained focused on the patterns in her data, not philosophical interpretations. But as she compiled more and more testimonies, she couldn't help noticing a structure. There was a rhythm to these lifetimes. There was design. Subjects who had never met described the same processes of soul planning, spiritual guidance, and reincarnation with people they knew. And though the vocabulary differed, some used religious terms, others psychological ones, the themes were consistent. What struck her most was the lack of randomness. People weren't simply thrown into bodies at random moments in time. There was intentionality, guidance, and even collaboration. These weren't just memories of lives, they were glimpses into a much larger system, one that extended beyond individual lifespans. The soul, it seemed, didn't just experience. It participated, it learned, it chose, or at the very least, it agreed. Helen Wambach had begun her journey as a scientist, hoping to explain away the myth of reincarnation. But here, in the liminal space between lives, she began to suspect something much deeper. Life wasn't a chain of accidents. It was a sequence of lessons, intricately interwoven and sometimes astonishingly well planned. The data didn't just tell stories of the past. It hinted at the architecture of existence itself. When Helen Wambach's research extended into the final moments of life, she encountered perhaps the most sensitive and profound part of all: death itself. During hypnosis, as participants recounted their past lives, they inevitably arrived at the moment of death. And again, something extraordinary happened. Subjects described death not as an end, but as a release, often a gentle, luminous, and even joyful transition. To Wambach's surprise, this moment, so feared and misunderstood in modern culture, was frequently remembered with serenity, even reverence. Approximately 85% of those interviewed described death as peaceful. The moment of leaving the body felt, in their words, like floating upward, slipping out of tight clothing, or waking from a dream. Many spoke of watching their physical body from above, detached and calm, with no pain or fear. One participant said, "I felt free, light, like I was shedding something heavy. My body was so tight and sore, and then suddenly, I wasn't in it anymore. I was myself, but not stuck." For these individuals, death was not frightening. It was a return, a reuniting, a homecoming. Even the remaining 15%, those who died in agony, in war, in childbirth, and accidents, reported something deeply similar once they passed the threshold. Pain and confusion might fill the final physical moments, but once death occurred, the suffering ended abruptly. It was as if the soul simply stepped away from the trauma. There was screaming and blood and heat, one subject said of a battlefield death. But then, nothing, just quiet, like stepping behind a curtain. Some recounted lingering confusion, especially in violent or sudden deaths. One described wandering a foggy field after being killed in war, unaware at first that he had died, until a kind voice helped him remember and move on. Another said she stayed near her grieving husband for days, unable to leave him, until she sensed light calling her back. A common element across many regressions was the presence of others, relatives, spiritual guides, or in some cases, a version of themselves. Some saw familiar faces waiting to receive them. Others met radiant beings or felt surrounded by a warm intelligence. The overwhelming tone was one of welcome, understanding, and love. These meetings weren't chaotic or fantastical. They were structured, purposeful, and deeply emotional. One subject said, "My grandmother met me. She died 10 years earlier in that life. She was younger than I remembered her. She just looked at me, and I knew everything was okay." Wambach noticed a striking pattern. Despite the diversity of participants and lifetimes, the moment of death followed a similar arc. A release from the body, a shift in awareness, a light or presence, a sense of return. This echoed themes found in near-death experiences studied by physicians and psychologists, but Wambach's subjects weren't clinically near-death. They were ordinary people under hypnosis, describing lifetimes they couldn't possibly have known firsthand. And still, the structure of death was there, in detail, in feeling, in astonishing consistency. One haunting but important detail stood out in Wambach's data: the remarkable rarity of suicides in past life accounts. Among thousands of regressions, very few participants described ending their own life, and those who did often expressed regret, not because they were judged but because the decision had interrupted something meaningful. "I left too soon," one subject said. "There was more I was supposed to do. I see it now. I'll have to go back and try again." The tone was not punitive, but reflective. A missed opportunity, not a moral failure. What emerged was a new understanding of death, not as annihilation, not as punishment, but as transition. The data showed that the dying process was not chaotic or terrifying for most souls. It was natural, structured, known. The fear of death, Wambach concluded, might be a uniquely modern and cultural construction, one that simply didn't match what her subjects consistently remembered. To Helen Wambach, who entered this research trying to debunk mystical belief, these findings were staggering. The moment of death, described again and again, was not darkness, but knowledge. Not disappearance, but awakening. The soul didn't end, it returned, and it did so with purpose, with clarity, and, more often than not, with peace. In the quiet of her data, away from any religious dogma or philosophical agenda, Wambach had uncovered something remarkable. Death was not what we thought it was. It wasn't the enemy. It wasn't even the opposite of life. It was part of life, a doorway. And those who had walked through it, even lifetimes ago, seemed to remember that they had not vanished. They had gone home. Helen Wambach never intended to become a pioneer of reincarnation research. She was, first and foremost, a scientist, trained in psychology, steeped in academic rigor, and committed to rational analysis. Throughout her career, she was careful to avoid spiritual speculation. She used standardized questionnaires, conducted large-scale group sessions, and meticulously documented the data. Her goal was clarity, not belief. And yet, despite her efforts to stay grounded in science, the very nature of her work pushed her closer to something that many academics weren't ready to accept. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Wambach's name had begun circulating within fringe psychology and metaphysical circles. But within the academic world, her reputation became increasingly fragile. Colleagues who once respected her scientific integrity began to distance themselves. The topic of past lives, no matter how methodically studied, was still taboo in most universities. Even though her methods were precise and her conclusions cautious, many dismissed her work outright simply because of the subject matter. She wasn't promoting a belief, she was reporting data. But for many, even the data felt too dangerous. As a result, her books never received wide academic recognition. Reliving Past Lives and Life Before Life were published, read by dedicated followers, and quietly disappeared from shelves. They were never picked up by major publishers for reissue. Libraries carried them for a while, but they slowly vanished from catalogs. In time, her name slipped into obscurity, overlooked not because her work lacked merit, but because it challenged too much. And yet her research didn't die. It simply moved underground. In the 1990s and 2000s, other names began to rise. Michael Newton, Brian Weiss, and others, who brought past life regression into the mainstream. They wrote bestsellers, gave lectures, and introduced terms like between lives regression to the public. Many of them openly cited Wambach's work. Newton, in particular, praised her for laying the groundwork. He built upon her foundation, using some of her methods and echoing many of her conclusions. Without her, the entire modern field of regression therapy might look very different. Wambach remains, to this day, one of the few researchers who approached the topic of reincarnation with statistical discipline. She didn't just collect anecdotes, she built databases. She didn't just listen, she measured. Her sample size was large, her controls were thoughtful, and her results were consistent across age groups, education levels, and backgrounds. She wasn't trying to prove anything mystical. She simply asked, what do people remember under hypnosis? And are these memories consistent with known historical facts? The answer, again and again, was yes. But something else happened during her years of research, something harder to quantify. Wambach herself changed. She began her journey as a skeptic, armed with scientific tools and intellectual distance. But by the end, she admitted that the data had moved her. She never became dogmatic or spiritual in the traditional sense, but her language softened. She began speaking of the soul not as a metaphor, but as a real phenomenon. There is too much here, she once wrote, to be dismissed. The weight of the evidence shifted her, not toward belief, but toward openness. In the end, Helen Wambach never claimed to have proven reincarnation. She rejected that word, proof, but she did something more valuable. She presented evidence, measurable, repeatable, statistically sound, that pointed strongly in its favor. She challenged skeptics not to believe, but to explain. How could so many people, across decades, describe forgotten historical details with such accuracy? Why would so many choose ordinary, even difficult past lives instead of heroic fantasies? Why were their memories richer than those found in history books? Helen Wambach's last truth was not a conclusion. It was a challenge to science to take the question of consciousness more seriously. A challenge to materialism to account for the memory of things never learned. A challenge to each of us to wonder, perhaps quietly, about where we've been before. Her work remains one of the most grounded and yet radical explorations of the soul in modern history. And though her name is rarely mentioned, her legacy echoes in every regression session, every past life story, and every person who's ever felt that their life is part of something larger. Something continuous. Something remembered. Dear friends, do you believe in reincarnation? Do you know any interesting cases related to the rebirth of souls? Write in the comments. If you liked this video, please like it and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. See you soon.